I was going to say, now it doesn't want me to share my screen. Okay. So this is being recorded. You probably were notified that it was being recorded when you entered. Let me see if I can get this nice and big here. So yeah, it is being recorded just for those who can't be here tonight and maybe want to watch it later, anyone who wants to revisit it. And we will hopefully have it up on the Allegheny County Library YouTube later this week. Because we had such a large amount of people who are signed up and excited to have these conversations, there is going to be a time frame based on the questions. We have several questions and there's going to be about 10 minutes for each question. Due to the number of people who are participating, we are going to open the floor to everyone to answer the questions. However, you will have a 2-minute window in order to talk, and Courtney and I will try to let you know when you're dwindling down on those 2 minutes. We know that that's not really a lot of time to talk about a lot of important things, but it is such a large group. So you will see that you are muted, and there is an option to raise your hand, I believe, in the chat. Or I guess if you can't find that, you can always say, raising my hand. And then we will unmute you. It will give you a notification that you're unmuted, and therefore you will then be able to talk. It's not letting me move. Okay. So the question will be posed, and you can raise your hand. And again, you'll be notified. And for best viewing experience, we recommend switching to speaker view. So you'll only see whoever's talking at the moment. So, all right. So, and you can use the chat. We do encourage you to have conversations in the chat. You are welcome to sit back and just watch what's happening. That is up to you. There's a lot of names that I recognize, some that I don't. So hello, welcome. I'm Allie from the Allegheny County Library System. And I guess we can go ahead and start this off. And if Alicia wants to go ahead and start with the first question, we'll go ahead.
Thank you, Allie. Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to see so many people arrive online here this evening. I know there's a lot going on and there's a lot that everyone is dealing with, but what a good way to connect as a community right now. This is an important kind of an experience that many communities around our nation are participating in. And we're just going to start with a question that opens the floor for this discussion. I do want to tell you, I'm Elisha Rominsky. I'm a professor of communication studies at Frostburg State University, and I coordinate our communication leadership lab there. We try to facilitate these kinds of conversations. So as a member of the Choose Civility chapter, Frostburg State's happy to participate. And we hope to see more of our students, be involved in this in the upcoming sessions as well. So question that we're going to start with is, what's your initial reaction? In particular to this section about Cotton Mather's, maybe just the introduction. What is it that you're thinking about a little differently in your view of history? And what stands out? Just to get us started. So anyone can start to respond now.
You'll probably have to raise your hand in order for us to see you. In the
Looks like Marianne Lutz is raising her hand. Allie.
Okay. Okay, I hit unmute. Did it work?
I hope so. I just unmuted.
Okay.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Wait a minute. What was the question again? No, I'm kidding. I mean, a lot of this history is new to me, particularly when we're looking at the really early sections of the chapter, because I didn't know enough, I think, about the very early centuries where slavery is being racialized. But one thing that struck me, even reading the sections that deal with slavery in like Massachusetts and Virginia during the colonial period, was watching, and I think Kendi just does such a great job of pulling this all together and helping you see it. The laws that were passed over time to further and further restrict African Americans and to ensure that they would always be enslaved. So taking away property that they held, for example, making sure that any children were born had the status of their mothers, just as examples. And I think he did such a good job of helping you see how all this is built into the legal system of the country in, you know, the colonial states.
Thank you, Marianne. Anyone else? You can build on that, or you can just offer your initial reaction to the book.
Oh, we have a raised hand.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, well, my initial reaction to reading, through these 6 chapters was just the shock that there were so many efforts in trying to justify the slavery of Africans. I mean, it just seems like year after year from the very beginning, they're just coming up with these new ways of thinking about it and these new laws and new justifications all of the time. And it's just shocking. Some of it, they try to use religion, some of it's money based. I mean, it's incredible to think that so much time and effort was used to continuously just enslave people. I mean, it was just every chapter that passed, it was just like getting deeper and deeper into it. It was just very shocking to see how much effort was really being put into keeping people enslaved. So that's what I initially got out of it, reading these first 6 chapters.
Thank you.
Other thoughts?
Hi, everyone. My name's Genevieve. I'm a student at Allegheny High School, and I was invited to be a part of this group, so I'm really happy I'm able to speak. One thing that I thought was super preposterous was the climate theory. I had never heard of that before. The climate theory of racism. It's just, I kind of had a really hard time wrapping my head around that. And I thought it was really interesting to see how racism was institutionalized. It wasn't just something that, was passed on word of mouth. It was taught in the schools. Like it described how in Harvard, you were given a hierarchy. But I thought it was really interesting to see how, in academics, you were going to try and prove racism through scientific means, whether the curse or the climate theory. But you're also going to try and teach all of your students that white is superior. So I thought I had never really seen it from that perspective. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Genevieve. Any other initial reactions or ways of thinking about, new ways of thinking about the history that we share?
It looks like I've been unmuted, so thank you. I was raising my hand. I'm Suzanne Wright. I'm with Allegheny College of Maryland. And the question is why? Why all this pseudoscience, and why all these religious theories, and why, generation after generation, more laws, more theories, more things are built. Follow the money. This country was built on the backs of enslaved people, and capitalism and racism went hand in hand. that is the reason for all of these ideas, all of these rationales. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Questions?
I think Tyler might be up next.
Believe so.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey.
I hear you.
To build off of what Suzanne just said too, what was really perhaps at the forefront of everything that I was reading was the way that we talk about we talk about slavery in the past as if it was just a thing that was and it was accepted. We never mentioned, or at least I've never heard mentioned, that there were active anti-slavery movements that were existing at the same time that were paralleling these that were paralleling the people justifying slavery. And the reason that really stuck out to me was the fact that how multiple times the slave owners, the ones with a vested interest in the continuation of slavery, continually had to buy off or enforce their racist beliefs in the non-landowner whites, the way in which they were forced into being part of the slave patrol, the way that they were kind of bought off from slavery, that they were kind of taught to see themselves as part of the slave owning class, instead of recognizing, hey, I have something in common with this, and that's that I also have nothing.
Yeah, that's powerful, Tyler. Thank you. So many insights that are very powerful and very painful.
Mhm. All right,
Anyone
guys.
else? Ready to move on?
Before we do that, we do have a very courteous group, it sounds like. So I think what we're going to do, if everyone is willing, I think we're going to unmute you all, and if you can take turns responding to the questions. We're going to try it that way. If it doesn't work, we can always adjust. Like I said, this is our first time doing this platform with this large of a people group. So we're going to attempt to do that after our next question. I believe Diane is number 2. If Diane, you'll go ahead and pose the question while we work on getting everyone the capability to respond.
Okay, first off, I'm Diane, and I work at Allegheny College of Maryland. I think we have quite a lot of students from my class. You want to raise your hand if you're doing your capstone project or if you're doing extra credit. So I'm really glad to see you here. Thank you for coming. I'm a sociology professor, and I also am with the College to Community Partnership Center at Allegheny College. So very happy, and a member of Choose Civility, a very proud member of Choose Civility, and the local NAACP chapter. So my question is the second question, and if you read the book, you know that there was a lot of talk about, Dr. Kendi talked about segregationists, assimilationists, and anti-racists. And those are all very complicated words if you haven't read the book. So just really briefly, I'm going to throw out a definition. Segregationists believe that people of different races should be separated. And throughout history, not as much today, there was a lot of separation of the races, and there was policies and laws that enforced that. The second one is assimilationists, and assimilationists is sort of opposite. It's believing that all cultures should work together, assimilate, and be productive together. And then the very last thing that Dr. Kendi talks about is an anti-racist. And an anti-racist is not somebody that is not a racist. Somebody that's not a racist doesn't do anything. But an anti-racist actually does activities, they advocate, they do things to end racism. So the question is, now that I gave you a little definition, were you familiar with these terms before you read this book? And if so, where did you learn them from? I'd love to hear other people's voices.
I personally was not familiar with those terms before I read the book. I found them to be interesting. I had to kind of reread it a couple of times and piece it together a few times just to make sure that I understood what each of the definitions meant. And I'm glad you gave us kind of a re-explanation because I had to refresh myself again after reading it. So, but I'm starting to understand it more.
Thank you. Thank you. Somebody else?
I also wasn't familiar with the book, and I know that I'm trying to teach my children to be anti-racist. And in today's climate, it's definitely something that's very, valid and comes up a lot.
Okay, I heard you. There's a little bit of feedback going on. And I'm not sure why, but I heard the gist of what you were saying. You're sort of questioning why it's happening.
I think there might be someone else who's trying to talk at the same time. Cindy.
Yeah, does other people hear feedback right now?
Yeah.
A little feedback.
We might have to mute everybody, I'm afraid.
Am I able to speak?
You are.
Yes, I can hear you. Good.
You can hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Sydney, and I go to Allegheny Community College. I just want to say that I did know the term segregation, but I was not familiar with the term anti-racist. I know the word segregation from my grandparents who have experienced a lot of those things when they were growing up.
Somebody else?
Hi, I'm Carrie. I am in your social problems class. I do a lot of reading on history for different cultures, different countries. So these are terms that I've heard and read in the past. It's been like a couple years, since I started the, human service program and stuff. So that kind of reading kind of took a back burner, but these terms I am familiar with and have read them in different writings. Doesn't make it any easier to read them in this book, but it's sad that they're out there. We don't need them.
Good point.
And I'm having a hard time relating to this book because this wasn't the way I was brought up. And so, and even reading, through the different books that connected with the Europeans and the witch trials in Salem and all of that, I have a really hard time connecting with that because this wasn't how I was brought up. We were brought up to treat everyone with respect, to treat everyone with love, to do whatever we had to do. And I apologize for that moaning. That is my dog.
Oh, is that your dog?
Yes, he's mad because he's not getting attention. He hears like everybody's voice and he wants everybody to love him. And that's just not the way that goes.
The joys of Zoom.
Right.
Okay, Suzanne, I think you had something.
Megan have a chance to answer.
I've already spoken, so
okay.
Maybe I should not, but I just want to talk about these three positions because I think they're really important. And as somebody who was raised, in the late 50s, 60s, 70s, I think the assimilation theory was, what we were taught, the melting pot. Let's all be one. But that one was white. It was let's everybody assimilate to a white norm. And I think what we have been seeing in the past, I'd say about 20 years, with the rise of hip hop culture and, you know, the NBA, and more than 20 years, 30 years, maybe 40 years, is that, you know, African Americans don't want to be measured by assimilating to whiteness. And that we, I think as a culture, are struggling with that. And that move to anti-racism, where it's no longer this white norm that you assimilate to, but to be your authentic self. And that authentic self is Black and is proud and has access to money and access to the popular culture. I think that's where we're swirling right now.
Would anybody like to follow up with that?
I think it really goes nicely into our next question if we're ready to do that.
Joy.
I did not hear Megan Whitmer's question or response, and I don't know if she wants to, because there was some interference, if she wants to say something.
Sure. I was just saying that I similarly, I grew up being taught, you know, to judge everyone by their character, not the color of their skin. So I actually was not familiar with the third term of anti-racist until I started reading this book. I didn't know that that was actually a thing, but I would say that that's what I'm trying to teach my children to be. I know that my oldest daughter is a teenager and she's very passionate about social issues and rights for, you know, everyone basically. And so I'm really proud of that, and I'm proud that they, you know, my children feel that way and that I've passed something on to them, because that's the only way things are going to change.
Excellent point. Okay, before we move on to question number 3, does anybody else have something to say related to that question? Assimilation, anti-racism, and segregation. Okay, I think we're ready. You're on, Sarah.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Welsh from Allegheny County Public Schools. I'm the Equity and Student Outcomes Coordinator for the district, and I'm also the Education Chair of the NAACP. And thank you for so many of you. I'm so proud to see so many ACPS folks showing up, and I'm really glad that we got to weave this in for some professional development, and then also so many of you just were really interested in coming because you wanted to read the book and talk about it. So I genuinely appreciate that. So my question really jumps off at the last one, and so we've already gotten some really great examples of what these terms have meant to you, or if they're really brand new to you. But certainly we can understand from this first section that those 3 terms, segregationist, assimilationist, and anti-racist, those are really the 3 prongs of Dr. Kendi's theory about, you know, his particular view on the historical racism. And so from this first section, this Cotton Mather section, what are some examples that you all saw that really stuck out to you about each one of those different ideas, the segregationist, assimilationist, and anti-racist? And I think we'll start with anti-racist because that's probably the one that has the fewest examples in this section, so that might be the easiest to pinpoint. So did anybody pick up on Dr. Kendi's examples from this Cotton Mather section about anti-racist ideas? And it really, you know, beautifully jumps on some of the things that a few of you mentioned about how he's talking about how these things are all working together throughout history, even though sometimes we think about things like segregation as being something that was happening with Jim Crow laws. You know, this is really something that was going back all the way to the beginning of the idea of creating a hierarchy based on race. Does anybody have something to talk about in terms of those anti-racist ideas from this section? Marianne?
Yeah, hi. I've unmuted myself, haven't I? I think. Can people hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. I was struck by how early some of the anti-racist activities or coordinated efforts began, because I made a note of the fact that it was 1688 in two different places. You have Quakers and Mennonites in Pennsylvania, in Germantown specifically, and then somewhere else who, start a petition against slavery. And again, who's to say exactly how enlightened all of their ideas about Africans were? But you could see that in some of these, I had always known that the Quakers fairly early on began to take a stand against slavery in the United States and elsewhere. But 1688 is a lot earlier than I realized. So I thought that was a kind of notable example of it.
Absolutely, I agree. I think that was really interesting. And that is something that I personally am a Mennonite and didn't know that particular fact that deeply back, but it was so interesting to me, to the wording of that, of putting that together, that we're leaving this place that because of oppression, and we don't want to come here and see another group of people who are oppressed even more than we were oppressed over, and where we were fleeing from. So that was definitely something that stuck out to me in this section as well. Fantastic. And I think that maybe it was Tyler spoke earlier and mentioned about how the anti-racist things that were happening were really stamped down pretty quickly, largely because why were they largely unsuccessful? A lack of what? Genevieve, I see your hand waving. Yeah, exactly. Money and power, right? It goes to what Suzanne was saying as well. Yeah, that when you don't have money, power, land in these situations, then that's difficult to push a movement through. So absolutely. And in terms of unless we had something else from, Tyler? Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Tyler. Can you unmute yourself, or you? Yeah.
To kind of, I guess, maybe kind of repeat myself a little bit, build upon what you two just said. The most startling fact of the anti-racist efforts that existed during these time periods was the fact that they existed. We kind of think of history as an evolution of ideas, as an evolution of progress, but slavery was never something that was natural. That they had to keep justifying it and stamping down the racist movement because it wasn't natural. It wasn't something that we progressed. It was a cancer that we are digging out of the culture today. And just the reality that slavery had vocal opposition is powerful, because it shows that even 400 years ago, even all that long ago, which really wasn't all that long ago, but still, there was still an active movement to root this out of American culture.
Absolutely. Looks like Cynthia.
Okay. Hi. Just a few comments. One, the idea that the Mennonites and the Quakers were maybe some of the first to do it. It was probably also easier because they were in the North and not the South, so that there weren't as many slaves. And Philadelphia also was one of the centers where there were a number of free slaves. The other thing is that I learned several years ago, not all the Quakers gave up slaves in the beginning. There is even a story of one man a Quaker who went from farm or household to household where there were slaves, trying to persuade the slave owners as good, quote, Quakers, that they needed to look at their conscience and think about releasing their slaves, so that it was by no means universal, that everyone.
I think that is an excellent point, Cynthia, and I really think it leads really nicely into the moving from that anti-racist thought to the assimilationist, because Quakers were for sure involved in that assimilationist piece of moving from those anti-racist ideas into the assimilationist ideas. Anybody have any pick up on anything in that regard? I think this really dials down into the how can we take Christianity and make slavery make sense? How do those things work together? I do think there were early Quakers who were really leading the charge in that, in the Northeast anyway. Sure, absolutely. Go right ahead.
I guess what I found out that to realize that Christians decided that it was important to save the souls of the slaves, but not free their bodies.
Yeah,
I just
the rationale, right? That becomes that assimilationist rationale. There certainly are more things, because there were all of these various pieces feeding the idea of the various rationales as to why, kind of depending on where they were coming from in the world, you know, to justify slavery, enslaving somebody else. But definitely that became this really key, interestingly, because it became problematic early on because of that. I'm sorry, I've lost track of who all has spoken, but someone else earlier on was speaking about how all of this becomes codified in law very early, and that's why this piece about coming, the race coming through the mother side and all of these different pieces, because Christianity and becoming a Christian was complex for slave owners, because on one hand there was a lot of pressure about saving the soul, quote unquote, in that way, but also that became problematic legally. We've got a comment from Deborah Davidson. Absolutely. I think you can go ahead and unmute yourself, I believe.
One of the things that's problematic is...
Oh, it's hard to hear you.
Can you hear me?
Maybe turn up volume just a little bit.
How about now?
Still tough to hear you.
Speak into the microphone.
If you come closer.
Did we lose her?
I think we missed that, but maybe it's in the chat.
Mary Gardner, did you have your hand up at some point? Can you unmute yourself?
Okay.
Yes.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, but I thought someone else was speaking.
I think
We
Deborah
lost her.
put her comment in the chat.
Oh, okay. Well, somebody said about, I think you mentioned that they decided they would save the people's souls, but not their bodies. That whole thing was just another excuse. Okay, they didn't care about slave souls. They just used it as a justification. They were doing them a favor, if you will, as a reason to be able to be religious and live with having slaves. Okay, I mean, it was there was no concern about saving their souls deep down in people's hearts. It was saving their bodies and the money and power that that represented for the whites. Now, and one of the things, and this is maybe a longer term issue that has always fascinated me, is why slaves became religious and bought into that. Now, I can think of one reason at the time. It would be that, you know, the white guy wants me to do it. Maybe I'll get some special privileges, or he won't beat me so much if I, you know, start being a Christian and acting like a Christian. But the truth is that Christianity has stayed with the Black community in many communities more than with anyone else. It's a core part of the community. And that interests me because I think it was used as a tactic at the time to keep people enslaved. And I've never quite understood why Black communities continue to be very religiously based. Again, I don't want to stereotype, not everybody, but compared to my Scandinavian community, we kind of were able to drop that, you know, even though we're supposedly all Lutheran. But that turned out to be a problem again later on, because the religious community, that was the one time when Black folks could get together, and they were allowed to be together for ceremonies, and the minister, that became the core of anti-racist movements. And so much of the leadership for later movements came from the church, from the Black church. But I still don't understand, other than, as I said, I don't totally understand why they picked up on becoming Christian.
I think this is a great example of one of these big overarching questions, because again, these are the three prongs of this thesis. And so my hope is that I haven't read ahead. I'm just
Right. I'm a little ahead, but we haven't, yeah.
So I am expecting that we're going to see this continue, you know, throughout the rest of the sections, and that there'll be more insights, because it was very well covered in this piece of that. The complexity of those ideas and that really cognitive dissonance that so many people are facing. So I wanted to read Deborah's thoughts, and then I think we're probably out of time for this question. I need to move to the next one. So Deborah shared that that this is problematic for those in power to make the rules about who is in ascendance, who has the most value based on the skin color into which you're born, and religion. Doing this too is awful. It's based on a caste system and the retention of power. So yeah, absolutely. So thank you everybody for that. And again, we're thinking about those three things as we move through all of these sections. So we'll definitely revisit those. And if there was something this evening that you didn't get to share, we'll have more time to talk about it in future sessions. So I'll pass it on to question number 4.
Okay. Question number 4 is Tiffany Fisher's question, and I texted her. She's vice president for the local branch of the NAACP, and overwhelmed, totally overwhelmed. So she wasn't able to participate. Does someone want to ask her a question?
I'll go ahead, Joy, if that's okay. So I'm Courtney. I'm with the library system, who is helping to host this discussion about this important topic. Actually, some of our discussions with the last question, of course, lead into this. Everything kind of connects. But so our next question is, Dr. Kendi discusses the Puritan beginnings and focuses this first section on one of its most influential members, which of course is Cotton Mather's. What puritanical influences do you still see in America? So not only are we looking at what's going on in the book in history, but we're looking at what's going on today, which we kind of touched based on that. You know, in our history, we have to talk a little bit about religion and kind of talk about its influences and how it impacts us today. So I'll open the floor to kind of discuss that more. Absolutely. Go ahead, Genevieve.
So to answer this question, I wanted to share a little story about how I came across this book, this dance book. So I went to the bookstore like a normal person and was looking in the history section, thinking that that's where I would find this. Of course not. I looked like 4 or 5 times, still couldn't find it. So I asked for some help. It wasn't in the right place. And so just I was kind of aimlessly wandering around. I found it right next to this book, one of the Twilight books, in the fiction section. And I was like, what? And so that got me thinking, it's like, that's how sometimes we respond to problems, is that we're just going to put it in fiction. We're not going to face it head on. We'll just put it in the fiction section. And so I can see that kind of in the beginning of this racism, epidemic, if you want to call it, is that, we're just going to put it in the fiction section. It's not something that, we need to deal with right now, because it's for the betterment of, the white privileged population. And we can still see those echoes today, especially with like our current problems. Is that what happens if people put racism next to Twilight? Then we get some big problems. And so I thought that was very like symbolic and just weird to come across. And that was my answer to the question.
Wow. I'm in shock that that happened. It's great insight though. Thank you. Anyone else?
I could say something.
Sure, Diane, go ahead.
Okay, I'm trying not to say anything because I'd love to hear from the students, but I had to jump in here. So one carryover I think that troubles me a lot today is the words black and white, as if we all fall into this grand category of being black or white. And those words were made from policies to help people in power separate us, so that the white people would have more and the black people would have less and be enslaved. And so that's a terrible carryover, and I struggle with it all the time. I hate the word black and I hate the word white. I hate that polarization, that, black, white, that people are separated in these two categories. So to me, that's sort of a carryover.
Thank you. See anyone else raising their hands?
Diane, if you've said you don't prefer the black and white naming, do you have a suggestion of an alternative that would be preferred?
Well, we have ethnicities that we actually came from. If we wanted to say Irish or Italian or all the different ethnic flavors, but again, that points right away to black people who were enslaved, came to this country, and they're totally disconnected from their roots. They don't know where they came from in Africa. They don't know what their traditions are. They don't know what their culture is. And it's just another example of how much we have taken from them, the people in power. Racism is something I think that's constructed from policy. It's not that people are born racist. We've adopted the policies because we think they're true, but they're not true at all. They're just policies. We are all individuals. We're not black and we're not white. That's, to me, that I have a problem with that.
Thank you for explaining further.
Thanks.
I think Tyler was interested in adding a comment. If you'd like to go ahead, Tyler.
Yes, to respond to the question about the puritanical holdovers that continue to the present day, and I think the name of that section, "Save Their Souls, Not Their Bodies," is kind of a kind of perfect way in which the Black community can be viewed today. In that there's this white parental attitude to them that, oh, we know what is right for them. We know that they cannot be trusted with their body, with their soul. They need us. They need us in their communities. And that idea is especially rampant when it comes to current issues such as policing, et cetera, so forth. This idea that they cannot be trusted with their bodies, their souls, their communities, their businesses, that they need a white savior to protect, to guide. That's one way in which that kind of attitude has held over and manifested into something even more controlling and more insidious today.
Suzanne.
Can I weigh in one more time?
Yeah, one more time, and then we have someone in the comments.
Okay, very quickly. I just want to get back to Diane's, black-white dichotomy, yin-yang, and her comment that we know where we came from, that we have these ethnic identities. I would argue that whiteness was created as not black, and that people in power, people with economic interests, united immigrants from very early on to identify as not black and created a whiteness, because people did come from, Scots-Irish or Germany early on, and then later, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. But whiteness was always identified as not black, and that is how companies, anti-union people, keeping wages low, at least you are not black. And if you look at the populist movement, in the early 20th century, it was very much uniting black and white farmers and workers together until whiteness sort of took over. So I think white identity has been created in reaction to blackness, and we need to understand that.
Thank you. I'm going to, there's some great comments in the section. I won't read all of them, but we had Kira Lano, I apologize for your name. If you could. Hi.
It's Kira. Sorry. It's kind of going, this is not off of what Suzanne was saying, but it's just kind of another generalized idea that I feel like is still very present today. And it's definitely one that stood out to me once I read it. It was individualizing like white negativity, but then also generalizing black negativity. So it's in the sense of every time a black person would do something negative, it was because that's what's wrong with black people. But then when it was talking about white, someone that was white that did something negative, that was just that white person and what they were doing. So I feel like individualizing somebody who's white and just what they were doing as negative is still very present today, and making it like that's what they did. But then when a black person does something negative, that's what black people do. And I think just reading that alone like made me realize how much that still is very present today. So,
which goes back, of course, to all of our terms that Sarah discussed earlier with the segregationist, the anti-racist, the racist, which of course is a huge theme in this book. Oh, Joy, last comment.
Well, the question was, what remains, or what is still influential as far as Puritan thinking is concerned? And I think there are many answers to that question, perhaps, but one that I thought of is that there's something about Puritans being so certain that they are right, that they are correct. And if you're not like that, then you're doomed. And I think we still have elements of that among white people in the US, among Europeans.
Thank you. So we are about to the next question here. Rebecca, did you get a chance to join back in? I'm not sure.
Can you see her? She just texted me that she was trying to, she tried to speak but couldn't be heard.
Maybe she is muted here as one of the phone numbers.
Yeah, does she show up here on a screen?
Unfortunately, there's not, her name is not there that I can see.
Oh, it's not on your list at all, huh?
I have some phone numbers listed, but not specific names. Are you seeing anything, Allie?
No, I just see the numbers.
I tried to unmute the one, but.
Well, that's a shame.
Oh, well, we apologize, Rebecca, that, okay.
Okay.
I can go ahead and read the question. And then hopefully Rebecca will be here next time.
We apologize. We're still learning. Thank you for bearing with us.
Okay, so the next question. Dr. Kendi argues that racist ideas have not inspired racism and racist policy, but were spurred by racist policies themselves. Racist ideas historically developed to justify those policies. So what policies do you see today that would fit this premise? For example, the climate theory was used to justify the white supremacy and later to justify and institutionalize slavery. So I guess what is still kind of present today? What kind of policies are still spurring racist ideas today? Anyone? Let me see if I can find the climate theory in the book for those who have not read it. And if anyone wants to join in and talk while I find that.
I can speak to that. The climate theory was Aristotle's theory that really justified the central power of the world at the time being in the Mediterranean region. And so anybody who was either too white or too dark was not as ultimately as well-rounded and therefore suitable to be in power as the folks in the Mediterranean region who were the right shade to be in charge. That's the very short summary of climate theory. But that was there were lots of spin-off pieces that came from that over time. But that's the summary.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Isn't the climate? You live in Africa. The sun is very hot. Therefore, you're dark. And the idea was that if you moved into a climate that was more temperate, as years went on and generations went on, you would become white. You know, your skin color would fade.
Yeah, that was one of the later ones, the later pieces of that, the belief that sprung out of that Aristotle's original theory.
It's interesting that, you know, the word slave comes from Slav, S-L-A-V, and that the people who were Slavic were some of the first slaves.
Yeah. So it's the Greeks who were the best people.
Yeah, I even have a quote highlighted that is part of that, and it was inferior people who were ugly and lacked the capacity for freedom. So that's terrible. And I think anyone who has the stamped one, the climate theory, is more explained on, I think, around page 17. So if anyone wants to look more into that, but it did develop later on to say, which is just crazy. They basically were like, hey, this theory was wrong. Let's try to come up with a new idea that still fits slavery and still makes this theory right, even though we've proven that this theory is wrong. Which I think is still things that we try to do to justify things today. Yeah, I see some things in the comments. Stop at risk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mass incarceration. I think the documentary, The 13th, also does a really good job at explaining some of these things. Just how laws have been made over the past hundreds of years, basically in order to continue to oppress people of color. The war on drugs was a big one that was discussed in the 13th as well. Any other comments, or does anyone want to talk about any of the policies that were discussed in the book? Tyler, you can go ahead.
To answer your question about what policies we see that currently require racist justification to be implemented. One looks only and you meant the 13th is a great example of a documentary that talks about this. The heavy policing in poor communities of color that relies on the racist justification and belief in the image and stereotype of the violent Black person that is then used to justify all the resources, all the extra energy spent into policing and oppressing these communities. That did ultimately go back to, as the 13th says, in the war on drugs, the breakup of the Black Panther movement, et cetera, and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's a great addition. I was trying to find, because there was a section in the book that actually talks about, which is a stereotype still today, that when the slaves were fighting for their freedom, they were marked as violent instead of just fighting back against, for their freedom. They were marked as violent then, and that is something that has stuck for, since the 1600s. So, there was several stereotypes that I just could not believe had been implemented during the 1600s, and we still have today.
I think Marianne had her hand up.
Had to unmute myself there. I just want to talk briefly about one connection I made when I was reading this. I was really struck by something that Virginia did, and it looks from my dates here, I don't have the exact date, but it was maybe very late in the 1600s or early in the 1700s. They seized any property that the enslaved people had. And they took the profits from that property and gave them to the quote unquote poor of the parish, who would have been the poor whites. And that when white servants were freed, they were given 50 acres of land. And so I couldn't help but think about, what happens after World War II? You have all these people who've served their country, should benefit from the GI Bill. And the white GI families get to live in Levittown. And meanwhile, African-American families are redlined out of having a decent place to live. And there's still efforts going on in places like North Carolina today to really try to twist whatever law people can to get property that is currently in the hands of African Americans, because they're near, the Outer Banks. And so, this can be a great tourist attraction site. And so it's still going on today.
Is there any other comments?
Yeah. So this is can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a section in the book that, if I can quote, if that's okay. It says, it may seem unto as little purpose to teach as to wash African Americans, but the greater their stupidity, the greater must be our application. So basically, I read that quote because growing up, I'm 19 and I go to ACM, but growing up in Brooklyn, New York, we never learned anything about, like pretty much you heard about slavery, but it was never like an African American, you never heard about who invented any African Americans inventing anything. You never heard anything good about African Americans. The most you've heard was about Dr. Martin Luther King, and that was probably about it. So there was never an anti-racism education. And I think that's the issue, that's part of the problem, that African American children do not know what their ancestors have contributed to the community, what their ancestors have done to help us move hundreds of steps forward. A lot of children do not know that. So being 19 years old and knowing a lot of this, because I've taken classes, is one thing, but there's a lot of people that can't afford those privileges. A lot of people that can't afford to learn certain things about their culture. They only know what they hear on TV. And when they hear certain things on TV, it is what the girl said before. You're not hearing if an African American gets robbed. You hear all the bad that they have done in their lifetime before they can even address the situation that they are in now. They were wronged, but you hear the bad about them. So I think that's the issue that we're having. The issue is that African Americans, before they can even talk about the good they have done, they must always address the bad. And I think that's where the problem starts. And until we can correct that, it will always be an issue.
I saw a comment on Twitter earlier today, and it was talking about how in schools, white history is the main history that you have to know, and then any other history is basically like an elective that you can take. And it's why is that? Why are they not combined? Why are we not learning all the history? Why is there this history erasure happening? Which, I mean, we know why, but in order to be anti-racist, we have to talk about all those things.
Right. This is Rebecca. Can you hear me?
Hello, Rebecca.
Hi. Oh my gosh. Well, I've been listening on the phone all this time, and then in trying to speak, I did something wrong and disconnected and had to call back, but in calling back, I now can speak. So if it's okay, forgive me. I was supposed to ask one of the questions, and of course I couldn't get through. But I just want to say I am a pastor. I'm a retired pastor, and I'm with the NAACP. And I'm Methodist. And what appalls me the most about this whole chapter is that, of course, Christianity is the heart of all of this. The whole thing starts in Christianity. And you all have talked about that in many different ways. And that is such a cross to bear. If we have any kind of cross to bear, I think it's the role of Christianity in slavery and then still in racism. And if you don't mind, if I kind of move forward a little bit, because I think this is the chapter, this is the section that deals with religion the most, probably. And I just want to say, as a Methodist, part of our history is that in the Civil War, like I said, I'm moving ahead a little bit, but the Methodist Church had to split just like the North and South had to split because there were even bishops in the Methodist Church with slaves. That's just inconceivable to me. But then even later in history, in more Jim Crow days and as far as into the 60s and 70s even, the treatment of Black churches in our denomination just institutionally has been and was very poor. So that bugs me. Big time bugs me. Can I make one comment about Puritans? And I'll shut up.
Sure.
Okay, I just wanted to be sure I hadn't overdone. But another thing about Puritan thought is the whole sexuality thing and how they over-sexualized Black women, saying, oh, just look at their hips and their lips and, and just saying such. And in fact, apparently, there was a great deal of attraction, but they had to make it bad. And it's that whole, Puritan sex is bad, but in this case, especially any kind of Black, African-American, any kind of people of color sexuality is bad. And I think there's still discomfort, perhaps, with that in some ways. So I'll just leave it at that. But thank you for letting me chime in. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you for joining us. Okay, I think we are ready to move on to the next question. There was a lot of really great discourse happening in the chat if you didn't see that, so.
Okay, so the next question is, most of these chapters focused on how media portrayal reinforced racist ideas, like in Shakespeare's Othello and Aphra Behn's The Royal Slave. What racist ideas are shown in current media? No lack of examples here, I don't think. Anyone? Someone said blackface.
If I may,
sorry, go ahead.
You can go ahead.
Sorry, I'm like taking up all the time. So I'm just a teenager. So I haven't like been around as long as everyone else, but I've definitely been able to see like the progression of racial injustice. But I mean, that word doesn't give it enough credit, especially with everything we've started. And I mean, George Floyd was kind of the tipping point, as we all know. But how many tipping points were there before that? But there's always been some story. It's just we've never really had the motivation as an entire group of people to do something about it, in my opinion. And everything that we see, you'll never find two news sources telling the same thing. There's always going to be some kind of political twist, or we can't really just trust facts anymore, because these facts are all subjective. And everything that we hear and see on the news, it's just like the comments, it's ridiculous, if I could say that. What we see, all the bipartisan crap about we're going to try and convince each other to conform to this methodology of racism, and that's you can't escape that. Like, it's everywhere. Movies, books, news. It's just you're never gonna find something that just gives you the facts, because all those facts are subjective, like I said. There's like you said, there's no shortage of injustices that we could talk about. There will never, hopefully, there will come to a point where there won't be enough to talk about. But as of now, that is not the time.
There's some wonderful examples in the chat here. BLM terrorists and white people are Black Lives Matters, they're terrorists, and whites with guns are patriots. Any other, everyone can read that. Any others, anyone else want to speak? Yes, Megan.
I live in Bedford, which is a small town, and I did not grow up around here, so I wasn't raised the same way that people have been raised here. And it's all, my family has always felt like we were different because of that. And the racism goes really deep in Bedford. And we just had an incident here last week where the Black Lives Matter movement people were marching at night, and it was about 11 o'clock, and they were parked in a parking lot, and the guy that they were across the parking lot from his house, he came out shooting and shot somebody in the face. And I am so disheartened, like, to look at my Facebook. I have like 300-400 friends, and 99% of them are on his side, that, you know, he's a patriot and he was protecting his property. And I'm so sad. Like, the next night, there was probably 200 people in our town square with rifles and AR-15s, and to the point where my little girls, I have little girls, when we drove through town, my daughter burst into tears because she was so afraid of all these big, huge men with guns, that we went home and locked the doors because they were afraid, not of the protesters, of the so-called patriots that were going to protect our town. From what? There was nobody there. But the fact is, it's glorified. You know, they're patriots, but the protesters are the thugs who did nothing wrong except walk on a street through the night. And I'm so disheartened that, you know, all of my friends are basically racist. You know, I was like, I don't even have any friends that have the same, you know, feelings that I do. And it's really disheartening to know that I guess they were just raised that way, but I don't know how to change it. You know, it's other than raise my children, you know, differently.
Well, and that's huge. I mean, that's, being a parent is one of the most important jobs you can possibly have. So that's great. Any others?
Can I speak to
Yes.
Julie had a great comment in the chat about how Black characters are largely portrayed in fiction as well. And I just wanted to acknowledge I'm sure everyone's aware of the very recent passing of Chadwick Boseman, who was a phenomenal actor, and the film Black Panther, which was just so very recently incredibly groundbreaking to be a blockbuster film with, you know, with a Black male lead and largely Black cast. There's like one white guy in the whole thing. That's how that speaks volumes, right? That it took that long to be able to have a film that, you know, that hits that, and what an amazing artist to be able to portray all of these leaders with such, you know, such depth at such a young age, and what a loss to all of us that he has passed, you know, so early. And it's that's definitely something that, like, it's tough.
Well, I was thinking of Hollywood too. Every year when the Oscars come around, and what films are nominated, what films get bypassed, they are by and large films that basically, I mean, Hollywood is dominated by European culture. And somebody has said here, if you have a villain, that person is either Black or wearing black. Black is negative. And then there have been a couple of movies recently. Well, this one isn't quite as recent, but The Help was written by a white woman. I mean, it does deal with racism. And The Green Book. which I think is a couple of years old. And there's been a lot of controversy about those kinds of movies because there's a little bit of white savior kind of notion. Anyone want to comment on that or have other ideas?
Yeah, if I could just kind of, I guess, expand on my comment on what you were saying, Joy. I think something to note too is, a lot of what we consume is, media and books and the news and everything. And it almost causes these stereotypes to kind of snowball in a way. And, when you see a movie where like the hero is white, like I myself is white. So I'm like, okay, I can relate to that person because they're like me. Whereas if I were Black, they're not like me. So in a way, we're almost isolating the Black community in a way because there's not as much media for for them to be like, oh wow, that character's like me, they're the hero, they're doing these great things. Whereas as a white person, I could name like 20 movies right off the bat where there's a white main character doing some really cool thing or saving the world or whatever, and I think that's even perpetuated even more when in like the white savior complex where it's like, oh, there's this cool Black character, but they have to be saved by the white person to, elevate them. Whereas like, why do they need to be elevated to begin with? Like they're put in that position because of our society and the policies, not because they're an inferior person, but I mean, our media is almost sort of in a way, perpetuating those views. And for some people, that's just what they see. They just don't question it because if they're a white person, if they just might not realize, And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of recently is that a lot of us are starting to realize like, hey, just because we thought everything was fine, just because it doesn't affect us, it doesn't mean it's not a problem. So yeah, I do think things are starting to change a little bit. Especially with, Chadwick Boseman and some other, I'm seeing more diversity in movies and television. But I think we have a long way to go.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of my thought. And, especially recently with everything going on.
Suzanne mentioned something about white crime and Black crime and the different treatment within the news media that's given as well. And that I think is crucial. And someone here also is talking about Newton. And that's kind of interesting because throughout this first part one, there are scientists and there are political scientists who are putting forth as fact racism. And it's one of the things I taught philosophy, so I taught philosophy of science, and one of the things for us to always be aware of is that any endeavor that we're in, we are looking at it from our perspective, and that's true of scientists as well. Now, there are clearly you have experiments, and that makes it, so you have objective data to the extent that it can be objective, and there are checks and balances on that. But it's important to just take note of how it was justified in the scientific community as well. This is the beginning of science. Western science. Anyone else?
I'm going to say it looks like we have a little over 5 minutes left. So if anyone has any kind of closing thoughts.
My husband is trying to get on right now. He's so excited. He's been listening to this in the other room. I just got him set up. He's a movie buff and he's been reading the books. And do you know how to unmute it, or do you need to hop on my screen?
Am I unmuted?
There we go.
Right.
Myself.
So one thing I was just wanting to bring up about the movies and stuff is that we talked a little bit about the savior complex and the white savior complex in these movies, and it goes so much deeper than we realize because, for example, a very recent example of the movie La La Land, that musical that was up for Best Picture a couple years ago. That movie doesn't have a specific white savior way that we think about where a white person is saving a black person, but that movie, the main character, who is white, opens up a jazz club and basically saves jazz music from being relegated to not a non-existent form of music in the LA area, which is ridiculous because it's basically a white person saving a black form of music. And it's stuff like that it's more than just a people issue. It's literally a white person stealing and propping up culture that is specifically related to black people. So when you watch movies and stuff, if you notice and understand black people's contributions, you can see how they're being translated to being white contributions and white achievement. So that would just something to look in other movies going forward when you're watching stuff, because that was very recent. It was a couple of years ago. So and stuff happens like that all the time in film.
I'm glad you got on finally, Jeremy.
I have just an odd comment to add. Is that possible?
Sure.
I am not trying to defend the Puritans, but the way they came about and were, whoops, there goes our cat, were persecuted in England so that they left England, settled in Holland, and then came across to the colonies. I think they had to feel a very sure sense of their religion in order to do all of these things, to leave England, to stay in England while they did, and even though they were outlawed by the official Church of England, and to maintain their ground, and then come to a new land. I think it may have been that their sense of self-righteousness started off generations earlier as just a sense, if we're going to do this, we're going to put our lives on the line like this, we have to be sure of our faith. And so that they probably extended it in ways that were not at first evident. Meaning, if you're going to take those risks, you have to feel pretty sure about something. And they were doing this all for their faith. So I'm not justifying it, but I can see where the reliance on what their beliefs were about the Bible and Christianity were able to be misused.
Thank you, Cynthia. And we are almost at 8:30. So if there are any last comments from our guests who posed the questions to kind of end with, I'll allow kind of just your last thoughts, and then Allie and I'll close up the discussion.
Really quickly, I really, again, appreciate so many Allegheny County folks here this evening, students, teachers, administrators. It's wonderful, and I know that there are a whole bunch of people who are going to be viewing this in the recorded session. So again, I totally appreciate it. And just so everybody knows, in terms of Allegheny County, what the plan is for folks who are using this for professional development, they're going to either be infusing this into a lesson for students or some professional development for their fellow staff members or their faculty staff. So this message is getting out, this discussion is going to continue, which is really wonderful. And I'm just very excited about it. And I thank you all again for coming, and I really appreciate your involvement. So I totally appreciate it. Thank you all, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thank you for just doing this and choosing this book. It's so important and so helpful. Thank you all.
Thanks. Great team effort too,
Take care.
coordinating. Excellent.
Yes, thanks everyone. I just want to say a quick thank you to everyone that came. I'm Ashley from Allegheny County Library, and thank you to our captioner Brenda for transcribing everything. And I'm sure Courtney and Allie will close out, but again, September 15th is our next discussion. So.
Just a reminder that this was recorded, and we will have it up on the ACLS YouTube later this week. It will be posted on the Facebook when it is posted, so anyone who wants to visit that can, and we would encourage doing more discourse in the comments of that video, especially anyone, I guess, who is coming in late or just has something to add to it. We are, of course, you'll have chances in the next few sessions as well. So.
Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Good night.
Have a good night, everybody.
Night.
Do I just exit?